5-6 years now, where during the summer our programs will present a topic that's of interest at that time, and then we especially invite our law clerks, our volunteers, our interns as a way to expose you to the other parts of the work that you don't get as much exposure to, and then we open it up to the community. It's really exciting to see people from outside the caucus too coming here and just hearing our work. It's really the one time of the year that we do it in a systematic way. So thanks for coming, and it's our first brown bag, and thanks to also South Asian Bar Association for co-organizing this and bringing the pizza and the drinks and everything else. I think we'll start with Zahra.
We're negotiating.
Oh, sure.
Hate crimes against the Sikh community have been going on for decades, and the first reported incident of anti-Sikh violence was actually the Bellingham anti-Sikh riots of 1907. And that was Bellingham was a town in Washington State, and a group of about 200 or so South Asians who were Sikhs had come into work in the lumber industry. And Bellingham was a town that had a very active Asian exclusion league, and it had actually sought to keep out Chinese laborers, and it only let them in once a year during the salmon season to work in fishing. And so it seemed like the Sikhs had come to stay, and there was a lot of activity in the town around people sort of saying, you get the Asians out of the town, and there were articles in the newspaper, and there was this sort of deadline given of, by Labor Day they must go. And I guess Labor Day came and passed, the Sikhs had these good jobs, they were moving them up. And then I guess about 1,000 people in the town actually had a rally, an anti-Sikh, anti-Asian rally. The Sikhs still didn't leave, and then a day or two later, about 500 or so Caucasians in the town actually rioted and looted and forcibly tried to push out the Sikhs, and that sort of ended up, it did cause the Sikhs to ultimately leave the town and leave their jobs. And the issue was, the recognition was the local government, local law enforcement wasn't going to do anything to stop these people from pushing them out, from looting and taking their things. So those folks were forcibly forced out of Bellingham, and that's sort of a reflection of what happened across the Pacific Northwest at the time, also down to California, towards Asians of all descent from Japan, China, etc. And it's sort of a reflection, I think, generally with respect to anti-Sikh violence, it really is a reflection of the social norms of the time, of the currents, what's going on. So fast forward to 9/11, of course, Sikhs were disproportionately targeted because Sikh men and some Sikh women as well wear turbans, which the broader American community identified with Al-Qaeda and associated terrorism. Then again, fast forward to a decade after 9/11, and an incident like Oak Creek, which I think everybody's heard about, where a gunman stormed into a Sikh gurdwara, killed 6 people, injured 4 others, killed himself. During that whole time, Sikhs were never tracked by the FBI as a group that was being subject to hate crimes, and that was an issue that was always a concern for us, because hate crime tracking is data collection, and the purpose of data collection is to identify whether a problem exists. And if the problem exists, what's the scope, what's the magnitude, and then once you have the data, what can we infer in terms of addressing this issue? And so for law enforcement, addressing hate crimes, or at least tracking hate crimes, is linked to them allocating resources in terms of addressing the issue, ensuring that they were reaching out to vulnerable communities, and then also encouraging those communities to report. In our community, we just didn't have an incentive to report since we weren't tracked. We actually, the Sikh Coalition actually attempted, there was no social research done about our community. We actually essentially sought to collect our own data, and in 2007 and 2009, we surveyed over 1,000 Sikhs in New York City and in the Bay Area, and asked them, what are your civil rights problems? And what we heard back based on the data was that in New York City, 9% of Sikhs were being subject to hate crimes, whether person or property damage, and in the Bay Area that was 10%. So we knew that, aside from us anecdotally hearing about these incidents through the community, we knew that there was a problem. Oak Creek really changed everything in terms of the federal government's response to our community. We pushed them, we asked the Senate to hold hearings on hate violence, which they did in September. And the FBI finally met us at the table on this issue. And one of the biggest obstacles we had in terms of making this request to the FBI, and why I think the request fell on deaf ears for so long, was simply there was a feeling that, okay, well, we do track your community. All anti-Sikh hate crimes are actually, they're a subset of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate crimes. So they're being tracked, but the fact is that the government tracks the motivation of the attacker and not the identity of the victim. And so they're being tracked as anti-Muslim hate crimes. And so, our response for that was, well, I think this is an overgeneralization and an oversimplification of the issue. If you look at anti-Sikh hate crimes, the vast majority of them occur because a Sikh is targeted because of their turban. And so there's essentially a but-for issue. But for the turban, this person would not have been attacked. And so, given that the turban is uniquely a Sikh article of faith, the Sikh community is the only religion in which people are mandated to wear turbans, we do need to somehow quantify and track that aspect of the hate crime, even if it's an instance where there's a mixed motive, anti-Muslim or anti-Arab, and anti-Sikh violence. We need to track that anti-Sikh aspect of it. The other thing that we said to the FBI was that, listen, we know that you can do this data collection at a granular level in a really nuanced way. And one of the examples we gave them is, if you look on your own, the federal hate crime tracking form, with respect to the LGBT community, they really track the data at a very, very granular level. So they track anti-gay male, anti-lesbian, anti-heterosexual, anti-bisexual. Then they track anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, mixed group. Then with respect to gender identity, they also track anti-transgender and anti-gender non-conforming. So they've broken it down really at a very granular level for the LGBT community, and what we said was we need tracking that's done in a similarly sophisticated way for the communities affected by the post-9/11 backlash. So that is an argument that ultimately won the day. We also, it wasn't just our community, but ultimately the Hindu community and the Arab community, they also weren't being tracked. And they also made these requests from the FBI. And one of the things that we also pointed out in terms of this whole issue of bias motivation, which is very, very, it's difficult to process, it's difficult to prove that somebody has not only assaulted somebody, but also has a motivation based on bias. But bias motivation is very fluid. And if you look at, for example, Wade Michael Page, who was the person who was the shooter in the Panelists shooting, he was affiliated with the neo-Nazi movement, and he, neo-Nazis hate everybody. They hate blacks, they hate anyone who's not white, they hate Jews and Catholics, and they don't only hate people, but they exhibit violence towards those groups. So, for the FBI to say, well, this, to come in and classify this as only Islamophobia is oversimplifying the problem, I think. And the same thing goes for other communities. So, for example, there was the hate crime in December in New York City against a Hindu man who was pushed off a subway platform and killed. And when they caught the perpetrator, she said something to the effect of, I hate Muslims and I hate Hindus. Well, because the FBI wasn't tracking hate crimes against Hindus, that aspect of the bias motivation, wasn't being caught. And so, fortunately, again, Oak Creek changed everything. But on June 5th, the FBI did agree to start tracking data not only against Sikhs, Hindus, and Arabs, but they sort of took all the religions that are listed on the Q form. There were census data, and essentially, some other groups like Buddhists and Mormons, and they said they would collect it for everybody. But that's still going to take another year and a half or so to implement. The nice news about California actually is that, here in San Francisco, District Attorney Gaston, after Oak Creek, he reached out to the Sikh community saying, how can I help? And we, talked about this issue of hate crime tracking since it's directly related to law enforcement. He actually wrote to Kamala Harris's office about this issue and asked that hate crimes against Sikhs, Arabs, and Hindus be tracked. And they agreed to do it in the spring, and there was, little to no discussion that needed to be had in terms of something we needed to advocate for years. So that's actually something in this state will be implemented in 2014, a whole year earlier than that. So that's good news.
Great, thanks so much, Simran. I'm Nandini, and I'm sorry for the delay. We'll transition now to Angela. And I think, Angela, you were planning on presenting.
Sure, I can do that. And Zahra, did you want to follow up first?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, sure. If that's okay.
Yeah.
So, thanks all so much for being here. I just want to say, we don't fight, so you can move to the front row. We have a pizza, so we're well fed. But so Simran touched on how anti-Sikh violence is something that we've seen for a long time in this country. And it's also something that I wanted to highlight is that frequently when we talk about anti-Muslim violence, we think of 9/11 as a framework. Thank you. I appreciate that. we think of anti-Muslim violence as something that was tied to 9/11, and so I always want to highlight for folks that anti-Muslim violence existed pre-9/11, and some of the more recent examples of it include the hate and bias that happened or that were spread in this country during the Iran hostage crisis and during the first Gulf War. The function that 9/11 served in looking at hate crimes is that I think it brought our communities sort of plight to the forefront. It made those conversations central, and as many people sort of facilitated and perpetrated hate following 9/11, a lot of people started to ask questions as well about how do we help these communities, how do we support them. It's sort of the unfortunate consequence of the mainstreaming of that hate is you also sort of saw more allies needing to come forward, and in the days following 9/11, there were a lot of elected officials, a lot of media personalities who came out of the woodwork to say, we stand by you, right? It's, I think, a lot of what the Asian American community prides itself on as well, is saying that we were some of the first people there to say that we've seen what happens when this kind of crisis hits, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen to another community. So post 9/11, we've unfortunately seen a rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes and the normalization of them, right? So before, you'd sometimes see a rally, you'd sometimes see someone making a hate remark, you have these really violent instances, but in the last 10 or 11 years, it's become more and more normal. And many would argue, we take the position that a lot of that isn't just, so there's a couple of ways to look at the way anti-Muslim violence spreads. The first is people who sincerely don't know, right? So there are people who are consuming Fox News as their main source of information and who've never met a Muslim, have never met a Sikh, don't know the difference, and confuse that, and unfortunately act out as a result of that. I tell people that I'm terrible with statistics. It's the other reason I didn't do statistics for today's presentation. I hate them. They're just not my friend. But the one that I always remember is that Time Magazine did a study in 2010 asking sort of Americans, how many of you personally know a Muslim? And over 60% of Americans said they didn't, that they did not personally know a Muslim. Surprising for maybe those of us that are sitting in this room, those of us that are working in social justice in the Bay Area, but that's the reality for sort of mainstream America, including many parts of the Bay Area. And so if you've never met someone from this community and all you're hearing is what you hear on KSFO radio, and all you're seeing is the images and sort of talking heads that you see on Fox News, then unfortunately that will frequently translate to fear, which then can sort of spiral into violence. So that's sort of one driver of anti-Muslim sentiment. The other driver is our elected officials and sort of mainstream media culture. Unfortunately, in the last 12 years, we've seen people like Congressman Peter King, like law enforcement officials, like local elected officials in parts of Southern California, as well as Tennessee and Arkansas, all of our favorite places, in case you're from there, in which case I apologize, and you have my sympathies. But to that extent, like, you see elected officials and mainstream media sort of fomenting hate, right? So Congressman Peter King's hearings about the radicalization of Islam and Muslims were incredibly problematic, and those are a more recent example. We laugh when I reference Fox News, but I always remind people that it is the largest cable news network in this country, and that means lots of people are watching it. And so as you have talking heads in the media as well as in public office saying, there's a problem with this community, we're worried about radicalization in this community, and then as you see sort of, and I'll talk a little bit about law enforcement later, how law enforcement targets this community, it sort of feeds into the narrative and frequently will perpetuate the fear of those who don't know. So that's the second sort of cause. And then the third cause is people who are maliciously spreading anti-Muslim hate. And I highlight that because I think that it's important for us to sort of sympathize with and look for ways to bridge the gap to people who don't know and are concerned and scared about these strangers, right? But then there are also people that are making millions of dollars off of the idea of perpetuating hate. There's a great report out by the Center for American Progress called Fear Incorporated, and it looks at how there are millions of dollars being funneled into this industry of talking heads, of people who are paid to go out onto TV and talk about how there is a Muslim problem, who raise money to place bus ads in San Francisco and across the country, who have written the model anti-Sharia legislation, right, which seeks to ban the practice of Islam in a number of states. And so that is itself an entire industry. I mean, we joke that in this job market, if you want to make money, that is one surefire way to make it. It pays really well. I don't know how you sleep at night, but you know, to the extent that you need to pay your bills, it's an option, not one that I endorse, to be clear. And so there's a number of sort of things that are influencing that and mainstreaming it. One of the other statistics that we point to is that in the months following 9/11, the public approval rating of Islam and Muslims was higher then in the months following 9/11 than it was in 2010. And so looking at how all of these factors came together, the last thing I'll highlight is let's not forget to mention the fact that President Barack Obama is a secret Muslim. You know, he comes to the mosque with me. He's going to fast in Ramadan next week. But you know, the accusations against him are one, he's a person of color, and we can't say that out loud if we're. The great thing is that racism has been so marginalized that you're not seeing people calling him names because of his skin color. What you are seeing, however, are roundabout ways of attacking him. So he's not an American citizen, right? Except for he produced his birth certificate, and now they're inspecting it to see if it's been photoshopped or not, and that process is ongoing. And then, you know, he's a secret Muslim, and the challenge with that is you can't prove a negative, right? So he says, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Christian. He goes to church, he drinks the alcohol, he eats the pork, and heck, he even bombs the Muslim majority countries. But people still think that he is a secret Muslim, right? So as recently as 2012, when he ran for re-election, there were people in parts of this country who thought he was hiding his identity as a Muslim. And so you have all of these things coming together, and then this brings me to the law enforcement piece. Unfortunately, what happens is you want our communities to be able to turn to law enforcement to report the hate crimes to be tracked. But the result of having problematic elected officials in office and people maliciously spreading Islamophobia is that law enforcement practices are also tainted, is that we're working with our communities and saying, look, law enforcement is your ally, you should be able to turn to law enforcement. But what they're seeing are two things. One, they're learning through some of the great FOIA litigation that's being done by civil rights groups like the Asian Law Caucus and the ACLU, that law enforcement is using anti-Islam training materials, right? So they're being trained by the people in the Islamophobia industry in terms of how to interact with Islam and Muslims and how to deal with the terrorism problem. And so when we learn that the people who are going out and publicly attacking Islam and Muslims are also training our law enforcement agents, it makes people uncomfortable. It makes people feel like they can't trust law enforcement. It's a very parallel problem to what we saw with secure communities, where you wanted people to be able to call their local agency when they needed help. But if they were worried that their local agency was cooperating with immigration and customs enforcement, they were less likely to call them, right? And so it undermines that very sort of basic trust. The other thing that has fed into the Islamophobia narrative that impacts law enforcement and the relationship with law enforcement is the way the war on terror has unfolded in terms of terror entrapments, right? And so what we've seen in what we saw immediately following 9/11 was that whenever there was a terror arrest, the reaction within the Muslim community was, please don't let it be a Muslim, please don't let it be a Muslim, right? Like everyone would sort of read the story and look for the name of the suspect, right? And And if it was a Muslim, then you had the entire conversation in the media about what mosque they went to and how many times a day they prayed and how they were radicalized. And we started to make progress forward in that realm because what happened was law enforcement was supposed to be looking for the needle in the haystack. And the way they had started to do that was by adding more hay to the stack. And what I mean by that is that they were looking for terror plots to create. They were taking people who had terrorist-like ideas but no actual abilities and turning them into terrorists, taking aspirational terrorists and making them operational. In the last few years, that dialogue has started to change, and the question that people are asking is, what was law enforcement's role in that terror plot? There have been a number of them, including one in Oakland just in the last 6 months, where law enforcement sought out the individual who was isolated from the community, who had a history of mental illness, who had no connection to resources, talked them into a terror plot, helped them find a location, helped them buy the explosives, practice the explosives, and then accompany them to the actual sort of day of when the person would push the button, and then when they would push the button, they'd get arrested, and they'd be like, look, we've caught another terrorist. And this would feed into this narrative of, we have a terrorism problem emanating from the Muslim community, but I'm hopeful that people are starting to ask questions of, did that person need mental health assistance? Did they have low-level criminal problems? Were they actually capable on their own of blowing up a bank in Oakland? And I think that as that conversation moves forward, it creates an opportunity for us to push back and say, look, terrorist plots are not emanating from the Muslim community at a higher rate than any other community, and unfortunately where they are, law enforcement is complicit, and then pushing back and saying, how do we work with law enforcement to report hate crimes, to protect our communities, to do what they're actually charged with doing if our communities can't trust them, if our communities are afraid of the people that are supposed to protect them.
I was going to toss this to Samir first, just in the order might make more sense.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about hate crimes against Hindu Americans specifically, and some of the difficulty we've had as a community tracking and even addressing hate crimes. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. And it goes back kind of to the history of the community coming to the U.S. While there were some that came in the early 1900s, the majority of Hindu Americans, or Hindus, came to America during the 60s when immigration opened up. There's always kind of this hesitancy to identify themselves as Hindu Americans, and they were just either referred to themselves as Indian, or in later years referred to themselves as South Asian Americans. So that religious identifying marker was always absent there. So it's always been kind of difficult to even organize as a community, and then on top of that, how do you address crimes against a community when there's always mixed factors in the motivations? There's conflations between religious and ethnic identity, and there's a community that's hesitant and fearful to really not walk the boat and not to come out and speak out. And I think as some of the other panelists have touched on here, this problem dates back several years in terms of attacks against our community as well. I don't know how many of you grew up in the 80s, but during the 1980s, there was actually a number of hate crimes in the New Jersey area against Hindu Americans. There was a gang calling itself the Dot Busters. And if any of you who are familiar with Hindu religion, for both Hindu males and females, there's a sacred marking that they wear on the forehead. For the women, it's called the bindi, and for the men, it's called the tilak. So there's a clear affiliation here between the name of a gang that specifically their intent is to go after Hindus, and obviously religious markings of a community. Now, I just wanted to quickly read to you a quote. So this group was so brazen and so outgoing in terms of what they wanted to do, they actually wrote an open letter in one of the local New Jersey newspapers. And in part, the letter read, "We are an organization called Dot Busters. We have been around for 2 years. We will go to any extreme to get Indians to move out of Jersey City. If I'm walking down the street and I see a Hindu and the setting is right, I will hit him or her." So this was kind of the environment that many Hindu Americans were going through here in New Jersey in the 80s. And at that time, there was a large influx of Indian Americans, and of course, a large percentage of those were Hindu Americans into that area. So there were actually a number of open attacks on Hindu Americans and the broader Indian American community. One gentleman was actually attacked and killed. Another man was assaulted by 3 men with baseball bats. And one of the people that was actually going after him yelled, "There's a dot head, let's get him." And as a result of his injuries, he was left unconscious with a fractured skull and was in a coma in a week and suffered permanent neurological damage. So this history has been there for a number of years. I think in the post 9/11 period, it obviously changed the dynamic in terms of the motivation, and both Zahra and Harsimran mentioned the anti-Muslim bias that was present and the conflation between anybody looking Middle Eastern or anybody looking Muslim and attacks on them. So many Hindu Americans have, in the post 9/11 period, have also suffered. Harsimran pointed out the subway attack against a Hindu man, and there's also been a number of attacks on Hindu institutions. So this problem of conflation, I think, has been there for a number of years, and that's why the FBI actually tracking separately attacks against Hindu Americans is so important. Another dynamic there is also that not all Hindus are of Indian or South Asian descent. The most prominent example is the first Hindu elected to Congress, Tulsi Gabbard, is actually a mixed Caucasian and Polynesian descent. And then you have a whole sect of Hindu Americans that are known as Hare Krishnas that are primarily Caucasian. So how do you lump those into an anti-Muslim category? How do you lump those into an anti-other religion category? Or how do you say that those are South Asian motivated? Because obviously there's something else going on there. They're very open in terms of their religious garb, their devotional singing. So there's definitely a religious motivation there. So all these factors have kind of led to the importance of the community really needing to have this separate category, identifying who the victims are, identifying what the motivations are. Even if there is some conflation, you need that there to really be able to track it. And for the community, we've actually never developed as a community. We've not been organized, as I mentioned. We've never really had advocacy groups in the past, and are only starting to get to that point. And we've never tracked hate crimes. We've never collected statistics. So this is actually why it's really important for the FBI taking this monumental step and adding this category, is because we'll actually now, for the first time, be able to start collecting this data and actually able to use it to form those relationships between law enforcement and Hindu Americans. You know, we haven't yet established any protocols in our temples, but what happens if an attack takes place? What are the general security protocols to go through? So these are other steps that I think are really important to establish there with law enforcement, and having this hate crime category is going to go a long way to doing that. Another thing that was actually touched on, I think that's really important to point out is, and I don't want to talk too much about what they've already talked about because I think they did a great job in laying out the general landscape for hate crimes, but is this connection between hate speech and violence and hate crimes. Obviously, a lot of hate speech can be protected under the Constitution unless it, obviously rises to the posing an imminent threat of violence. But what does that what are we allowing as a society when we allow that to go on unchecked or unchallenged? And in today's internet age and social media age, it's so much easier to proliferate anti-religious sentiments or hate speech against particular groups. We actually put out, the Hindu American Foundation put out a group on cyber hate, a report, on cyber hate, and we found hundreds of websites that were just putting out like filthy anti-Hindu rhetoric, calling us devil worshippers or worse, and we feed our children to the devil, and all this kind of nonsense. So when you have this type of environment, and especially where everybody goes onto social media, everybody's on the internet all the time, people don't get their news from traditional sources as much as they used to. What type of an environment are we creating? Are we creating an environment that justifies these types of crimes? Are we protecting it? If we don't challenge that at its initial stage, is it at some point going to result in violence? And as you can see, a lot of the crimes, whether it was against that specific community, but there was always a hateful message that went along with the crime previously, whether it was they hate Muslims or they hate Sikhs or they hate Hindus, there's always a message of hate involved there. So I think looking at hate speech is a critical component in actually addressing hate crimes beyond just tracking it and addressing it once it's happened. And I think the ADL has actually done a great job as one of the organizations, Anti-Defamation League, in looking at cyber hate against all communities. But I think this is an area actually as collectively between all communities, a way to kind of come together and deal with this issue. Because hate speech is much easier to deal with before it results in violence. Violence, you already have a victim. What do you do now? You just try to educate again, but the result is there, the consequence is there. Somebody's life has been permanently changed. Some community's been traumatized. But when you're still at that stage of hate speech, you have the opportunity to really address it at its core basis. I think with that, actually, I'll come back to a few other things later, but I don't want to spend too much time on some of the things we've already talked about. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Angela.
Okay, so I will present a little bit on the hate crimes restorative justice perspective, and then, well, I think we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A and to get people's thoughts as we're running this. So we're at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice - Asian Law Caucus, which is our organization, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about us and then jump into our perspective on this. And it's interesting because we have multiple programs that really intersect in this area. We have the Criminal Justice Reform Program, which I help manage. We also have the Immigrant Rights Program, and we also have the National Security Civil Rights Program. So this issue of hate crimes really sits at that intersection, and the Asian Law Caucus has had a really long history of working on hate crimes and really evolving the way in which we've worked on hate crimes. So I want to just kind of share that narrative and where we're going, and I think working in collaborations with organizations at this table will help us get to that next phase of how do we deal with hate crimes. So we're founded in 1972, oldest civil rights organization serving low-income Asian immigrants, and we have a three-pronged strategy. We do direct services in these areas. So we have legal clinics several times a month. We have a pretty high volume of clients. A lot of law clerks and volunteers here are helping with our clients. We take that work is the core of our work, and it informs everything else. So that work informs the community education work that we're doing. That work also informs the policy work that we do at the local, state, and federal level. So that's our three-pronged approach. And so a little bit of the law piece. And this is just the California definition of a hate crime, but the federal one I think tracks this decently well. But under our California Penal Code 422.55, there's a definition of a hate crime, and it's a criminal act. That's one element. So a crime is made up of elements, and you have to prove each element beyond a reasonable doubt in order to convict someone of a crime. So it's a criminal act of any existing violation of a penal code, and then that criminal act is committed either in whole or in part based on these perceived characteristics. And once you have that, this is an enhancement. It's not a crime in and of itself. It's an enhancement onto that crime. And by enhancement, I mean more severe punishment usually, longer time in prison, more, kind of a severe or punitive impact of that marking of a hate crime as it's prosecuted and convicted as such. And part of what we're talking about today is for the FBI, when they track this, that they break down some of these categories such as religion along more categories than just Muslim, Jewish, Christian, etc. So that we're breaking down a bit more. Next slide. And then so what constitutes a criminal act? It can be really anything, but these are the more common ones: an assault, a robbery, a vandalism, intimidation, invasion of privacy, really any criminal act. Then you do that based in whole or in part on one of these perceived characteristics, then you can argue for a hate crime enhancement. And then this is data I just have for race. I apologize, I don't have it for religion. I need to put that together. But this is coming from the FBI. It's national data from 2010. And it gives you a sense of just how diverse the group is that actually commits hate crimes, perpetrators of hate crimes. So 59% is white, and that group, I bet you, is that's overblown because up until very recently, the FBI tracks Latinos as white also. So just know that that's not accurate. And I think there's just a recent announcement that they're going to start trying to not do that. And so that was just like, it came out yesterday. So just know that that's not completely correct. And then you have Asian Americans there, you have Native Americans, unknown race, all of that. So look at that, 38% of people who are tracked by the FBI to have committed hate crime are minority or an unknown race. So that really changes our perspective of the traditional thought of who, especially the Asian Law Caucus, because we've been working on this for decades, who we think commits hate crimes. Our traditional image in our head is it's a white man that commits hate crime in our traditional perspective, it was East Asia, and then as we're with our National Security Civil Rights Project and 9/11, all the work that we've been doing the past couple decades now, we've really expanded that work to understand that impacts South Asians, East Asians, all our whole really entire community, and some communities now much more than others. And I wanted to give you a sense of, in more diverse communities in big cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, that this new paradigm I'm describing, where hate crimes are not just being committed in that traditional fashion, what that means in these cities. So Los Angeles, I believe I think this is either the California Attorney General study or the District Attorney study in Los Angeles. They did a more decent comprehensive study of who commits hate crimes and who's the victim. And you'll see that the majority of folks who are tracked to have committed hate crimes against Latinos are Black, against Latinos are against Black or Latinos. And part of that might be true, and part of that might be also over-policing of these communities. So it's a combination. And when you use the criminal justice system as our remedy for any of our problems, hate crimes or anything else, it's that the criminal system, and I can get into a very long diatribe about this, was invented really to lock away people of color. It's not to lock away white people. That's not why it was invented, and it rose at a point in our economy where we didn't need as much low-wage, low-skilled people of color labor, especially African-American labor. And that's why you have a rise of the criminal system and all these laws that we have in California. We have some of the strictest and most criminal penal codes compared to any other state. And so when you use that apparatus, it's in general going to pick up more people of color. Also give you a sense, not only does it pick up more people of color, the criminal system really is aimed at also young men of color. And so the people who are picked up often for these types of hate crime enhancements are young people, are people either under 18 who are classified as youth and juveniles under our laws, or between the ages of 18 and 25. And then where are crimes committed in California? And it also gives you a sense, we often think of hate crimes as stranger hate crimes, but that's not necessarily the correct case. A lot of times hate crimes are committed just in your own driveway, in your home, in your school, in your residence, right? And so just they can be people that you know, and it's not just a complete stranger coming up to you and doing something. And then I want to talk about, so if you have that lens, of the hate crimes are awful, it should absolutely be condemned, and we should absolutely track that data, and you guys hit on a really good reason why, so that people want to report the data. If they feel like no one cares that this happened to them, no one's tracking this, what does it matter? They're not going to report it. So you do want people coming forward. You want to know who's harmed. You want to know who's doing the harming. You want to know that. So that's absolutely key. But then once you have that data and you know who's doing what, who's the victim, right? You have that, let's say, in finite detail. Then what do you do with that, right? Are we going to prosecute all of these folks under our hate crime statutes, both federally and statewide? Or are we going to do something else? And are we going to take different approaches depending on the type of case it is? I think there's a lot of those kind of questions entangle, and the Asian Law Caucus, as we started working on the criminal justice system from more of a defense side, helping juveniles who actually are Asian American, who are committing crimes, sometimes even hate crimes, how does the criminal system work for that, and is there an alternative? It was an organic adventure for us to find out about restorative justice, which is what I'll talk about, but we didn't originally think or focus on that. So, I'm going to contrast the punitive approach with the restorative approach. And in the criminal approach, crime is a crime against the state, right? That's why you have a district attorney or a U.S. attorney prosecuting it. It's not the victim prosecuting it. And they're the ones who the state gets the most airtime in court. Victims often rarely get a chance to even speak, right? And in a punitive model, it's a violation of these laws, right? The rule that I just described, you have to check off those elements, and then therefore you have a hate crime, right? And then once the state determines if you're guilty of violating that rule, the main tool they have is prison or probation or some sort of deprivation of someone's freedom. So contrast that restorative justice approach, it's very different. It's not focused on the state, it's focused on the victim and the communities that are harmed. And there's a lot of debate and questions about whether or not that would make sense for a hate crime, because the victim isn't just one person, it's much more that broader community. It's the Hindu community, it's the Sikh community, it's the Muslim community that is feeling that fear and that victimization when one person's harmed, because that could easily happen to someone else, right? It's just based on a skin color or a physical attribute or a belief about that person, and it's nothing that person has control over oftentimes, right? So the focus is on that, on the victims and on the other victims of hate crimes. And that when you violate that, when you commit a hate crime against someone, you're violating and harming a relationship, and now you have an obligation to address that. And it's different because it's away from the criminal system. It's ideally traditional restorative justice doesn't involve a court. It doesn't involve a court, doesn't involve a judge, doesn't involve lawyers. It makes us pretty useless. Instead, it focuses on the victim and on the offender and on the respective people who are harmed. There are limits to it. Restorative justice can only be used if someone admits that they did something wrong, right? If there's a question of innocence versus guilt, you do still need to use due process in our traditional criminal system. That's one piece of it. And another thing, it has to be voluntary. Someone cannot be forced into restorative justice. It has to be because you want to be at the table, because you want to hear what happened. You want to hear from the person you harmed, how much it harmed them. And you'll be surprised. I mean, sometimes people think, oh, restorative justice is just like a touchy-feely, San Francisco Bay Area hippie thing. But if, I've sat in on some of them just to see if that's true. And I sat in on them for juveniles who are committing crimes against each other. And you'll be surprised, they're harsher sometimes in other ways. You don't have to just be harsh by locking away someone, spending our tax dollars and taking away that person's freedom. You can be harsh in other manners. And that person being directly exposed to what they did and having to hear about the harm and the pain that they caused to someone else through their actions is something they actually don't often hear about if they go through the criminal system. In the criminal system, it's all lawyers speak, it's all legal jargon, it's hearing after hearing, you don't even know why you're there, right? It's just the judge and the attorneys talking. But in a restorative justice world, you take away those buffers and you just have that victim and that offender and the folks running that restorative justice circle. So you kind of have to face and hear what you did. And if at a point it becomes clear you're not being genuine and you don't want to participate, you're just using that process, and that process stops. It's a voluntary process that can be terminated at any time. So this kind of goes more into, I'll skip past this slide. And this is a sense of this is for the school setting, who would be a part of that restorative justice circle. And restorative justice can be on a continuum. You can use restorative justice as a complete independent system that's diversion from our criminal system. So at a school case, or if the police arrest you, they could decide to allow you restorative justice, and then you go through that, and then you do not have to go through the criminal system. So that's an independent way of doing RJ. A semi-dependent way of doing it is to use it only at the sentencing stage, after someone has been found guilty of an offense, and then they can opt to use restorative justice if the victim is okay with that. That's another way. And a completely dependent way of doing it is if the person goes through the entire criminal system, is in the prison system, and then they still go through restorative justice because there's still harm that's been done, and going to prison doesn't fix that harm. And how can you use restorative justice at that point then to start working on what you can do to address the harm that you've caused. So then these are the questions that you ask in a restorative justice process. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do to repair the harm? What's the agreement? Everyone has to agree. If the victim's not okay with it, doesn't go forward, and then holding that person accountable. And you'll be surprised the restorative justice process, from the stats I've seen, especially in the juvenile context, the recidivism rate is much lower than in the traditional punitive system. And so you're going to see a lot more follow through in this system than you will see in the traditional system. Part of it because the traditional system is just composed of a whole bunch of hearings that get drawn out for a really long amount of time. You might not even get justice if you call that justice in the end. Or that person gets into the criminal system. The way our prisons are organized, it's by race, it's by hate groups. That's our way our prison system is organized in order for people to survive in our prison system. A lot of our hate groups actually started within our prisons or grew within our prisons. So you get that. They come out of that type of experience, and they're not going to rehabilitate. There's no rehabilitation unless you use the restorative justice process once they're in prison, which is rare. San Francisco uses it through something called RSVP, but most prisons don't have anything like that. And so I think I'll be able to skip past this, but I'll just mention this kind of gives you a sense of how we're in a new world. This Tyler Clementi, Darun Ravi case, you have an LGBT appearing to be a white college student and a South Asian college student, and he's spying on and invading the privacy of this college student, and this college student commits suicide because he feels like it was not very clear exactly why, but the perception is that he committed suicide because he feels like he was being bullied because he's LGBT. And so this kind of brought up, this is like its own presentation, but it brings up issues of race, of ethnicity, of LGBT status, and it turns out Darun Ravi is a green card holder. And so he was almost at risk of deportation. So all of those issues conflated and kind of take all the things I've talked about restorative justice and punitive and apply it to this and see what makes sense. And just where these ideas came from, New Zealand, the Maori population there has been practicing restorative justice. They actually have used restorative justice, I believe, for their entire juvenile system, even serious crime, and violent crime. And so I think the outcomes have been pretty good. If you ever get a chance to see folks from New Zealand coming to the Bay Area to talk about restorative justice, I would grab at that chance because it's pretty interesting to see what they've done. Hmong circles in Minnesota, it's another community that's done that, and it makes sense in these communities because you're like, we can't use our traditional system. So if we use our traditional system, we'll just lock up people of color. So we need to figure out another way, and that's part of why these circles are being used. And so that's, yeah, so you can use this in a school practice, in a school setting, use in an adult setting. It does have its limits, but it's just a way of doing it. I think, Zahra, I don't know if you have any stories you want to share, if someone else had stories about how you've used restorative justice in these settings, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
There's actually, there's one that Victor told on Saturday at a different panel about one that we worked with him, and it was sort of one of these horrific like intersections cases where it was a number of South Asian young men from the East Bay were driving into the city to go on these shooting sprees at gay bars. And so they were using BB guns and like I think were so sort of out of their element that they were targeting straight clubs, not even realizing it was the wrong club.
And they were filming it.
And they were filming it, and that was the part that I remember when I got that call a couple of years ago. It was my first year on the job, and I was like, so they were filming it, and they were Muslim, and I was just like, what am I going to do with this, right? Like, how do you even, like, 3 young Muslim men thought it was a good idea to go on shooting sprees targeting gay clubs and filming it, and I think at one point they hit someone and the police were called and they were detained, and they had all the evidence in the car that they needed. Unfortunately, people who engage in these things aren't particularly smart. And one of the things, so 2 things, we worked with the DA's office to make sure it didn't become a Muslim thing, that these were three men acting out of their own stupidity and bigotry and prejudice and not, motivated by their faith, and ensuring sort of that narrative was controlled. And that's really difficult when you have these intersectional hate crimes, is it's not about one community attacking the other, it's about an individual attacking the community, right? And then the other piece of it was the restorative justice piece, because you had these 3 men who were repentant and who, felt bad and needed and wanted to see the error of their ways. And there's a great sort of restorative justice type program in Santa Clara County. And so a couple of things that they engaged in were, one, like writing letters of apology, which doesn't happen in our traditional criminal justice system. Like, you don't see someone who's serving 20 years for some violent crime ever have to sit down and write an apology letter, and that itself can be a really jarring experience for that person. And then 2, to do community service at LGBT nonprofits to sort of humanize the community. And I don't know if you would thoughts on the folks who hosted.
Yeah. So before I go into that, I'll mention that the principles of restorative justice are needed not only in the criminal justice system but in schools as well. I'll give you an example. We represented just this past year an 8th grader, a Sikh who'd been subject to bias-based bullying since he was in 2nd grade because of his turban. And bias-based bullying is endemic in our community with respect to kids who maintain articles of faith. And I mentioned those surveys that we've done, and what we found was between 69 and 75% of kids in school who keep articles of faith are subject to some form of bias-based bullying. So it's really, we see some really terrible cases, and in this case, this kid, things came to a head this year. He's in the 8th grade, or just finished the 8th grade. A kid called him a slur and assaulted him, broke his nose. And what kept happening was that every month something would happen, but it was by a different kid or a different group of kids. So like the next month, so he was assaulted and his nose was broken. And the next month, some kids that was a kid of color. Next month, different kid of color, black kid before, then like Hispanics. Harassed him on the bus, threatened to kill him. He was scared to ride the bus. Then the next month, another kid in his class cut some of his hair, and as many of you know, Sikhs maintain unshorn hair for religious reasons. So that was, direct attack on his faith. And we had actually, after the first incident, filed a complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. They have jurisdiction when it comes to bias-based harassment in schools. And they actually ended up, the thing was that every single time something happened, the school sort of on an ad hoc basis was suspending these kids, but it wasn't doing anything to address the bias motivation behind these incidents, or the fact that this climate existed in the school where this could, keep happening by kids who didn't even know each other. So when the DOJ intervened, they basically, they investigated. They said, we would like to come to a settlement agreement with you, before we even litigate, and they have the muscles to do that. And institute a safety plan for this child. But also, one of the things they did was they basically forced the school to sort of do a really broad education plan. So it actually, not just that school, but the whole school district, which was over 100,000 kids, was, in the next year will be forced, or the school district has to work with an external consultant to come up with trainings that specifically address sort of post 9/11 bias and the backlash against Sikhs, Muslims, and other communities. So that's sort of that's a victory, and especially a victory not even having to litigate. That's sort of a huge deal, but it's just these issues. I mean, if we could do this outreach to schools, it's something that we talk about all the time. And we do a lot of. The other issues, that we a lot of times with respect to victims, help them make requests to court with respect to sentencing issues. We help them write their victim impact statements and then make requests that are, anything related to substance abuse counseling or anger management for the offender. We've worked with people who've gone into mediation programs with the offender, have requested a written apology, essays addressing bias against Sikhs, and then the community service piece. Whether we facilitate community service, whether in Gurdwara or in our office in New York City, which is a much bigger office, our headquarters. We tend to see hate crime offenders there about once a year or so, I would say. Most of them, if they have any sense of remorse or shame, they're usually pretty anxious about coming to community service in in an organization like ours that represents the community that they had offended. And they sort of fully expect to be the office will be where Whipping Girl. But are usually, our general philosophy is just to kill them with kindness, to literally, the goal is simply that at one point they had a negative association with our community, and we just want to turn that into a positive association by the time they fulfill their hours. So, and most of the time it works, most of the time it is sort of a positive experience for everybody involved, and there have been offenders who come in and sort of at the end of their hours have had some heart-to-heart conversations with our staff and really sort of have turned things around as a result of the types of restorative justice, not penalties, but sort of those types of efforts. The times that it doesn't work out, usually most of the time it's simply that somebody doesn't show up for their community service, and we have to let their parole officer know and then just let the criminal system take its course.
Do we want to go into questions maybe?
Yeah, and I want to open it up to you guys to ask questions, and if we still have time, then I'll cover you guys at some point.
Questions, thoughts,
Disagreements.
experiences?
I have a question. Nobody else.
And then when you ask a question, if you could just say your name and your affiliation if you have one.
Sure. My name is Nisha. I'm a summer law clerk here. I work with Angela. And I first of all, thank you guys for coming. I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate the need for tracking hate crimes against individual religious groups, as opposed to in the aggregate. But I guess my question for you is, do you anticipate or is there going to be a response to, now that these crimes are tracked separately, if there is a hate crime against one individual religious group, for other religious groups, maybe the larger South Asian community or whatever, to respond? So it's not just when now there's a crime against a Sikh individual, the Hindu community stays silent and the Muslim community stays silent, because these are no longer treated as the same category of crimes. So I don't know if that's something you anticipate or how to respond to that.
My thought is people who are, so the tracking is important. I don't think it changes the fact that the people committing the crimes are committing them for a variety of reasons and are unfortunately really just too stupid to distinguish. And that's not to say that a crime against any community is okay. So it still impacts all of us. And what we've seen is that when there is a rash against one community, there seems to be like that sort of plays out exponentially against the other communities. So like last summer, when there was the Oak Creek shooting, there was also a mosque that was burnt down. There were like
it was a 8 or 10 incidents in like a 2-week
back
period,
to back,
involving the Oak Creek Gurdwara and then like other mosques around the country. So it was something where you can't just take the shooting and sort of it was endemic for like 2 weeks.
And I think that's also the role of advocates then to circle back and looking at, for example, the example of the Asian American community that I pointed out to, where they said, look, where someone who looks Japanese American is not in all likelihood going to be the victim of a post 9/11 hate crime, and yet you saw that community step forward and say, we stand with you because we know what this looks like. And so part of the thing that I always talk about inside the Muslim community is it's important for us to rally for ourselves, but that's not particularly courageous, right? Like what's courageous is rallying for the next person and building the infrastructure so that whoever comes next knows that they can rely on our community support.
Yeah, I think, as an advocate, you can't do this work in a vacuum, and that's something that all of us civil rights organizations know and understand. We routinely work with one another. It's something that at times we need to help our community members and, make that leap and understand, but there's no way that we can do this work without it. We stand on the shoulders of the Asian American community in terms of all the civil rights work that we do for our own communities.
I think just adding to that, I think actually the process to get the FBI to add those categories was actually a moment that brought a lot of groups together that don't always work together, or disparate groups that maybe don't always agree on certain issues, but because there was a common issue there that affected all communities, that process I think was almost just as important as the actual adding of the category. And I think like they mentioned, it's up to the actual groups that do this work, and not just the communities themselves, but as representatives of our communities, we need to be the ones that are reaching out to our colleagues in other communities to make that relationship and make sure that we are speaking out. I know after the Oak Creek withdrawal incident, many members in our community, and I think that was one of those incidents where I think it was everybody from every community kind of really spoke out on that, and there was a real coming together of groups and communities. But I think we also really could imagine that happening to us, us sitting in our temples also with the gunman coming in there. So that was a real eye-opening experience, I think, for a lot of institutions. As advocacy groups, I think we already realized that, but for the community, I think it was a very eye-opening experience as well.
And I would add, it's not just the sort of Asian organizations that we work with. We routinely work with LGBT organizations on school bullying issues, and we stand on their shoulders with respect to their track record of bias, dealing with bias in schools. So we work with many, many, many organizations.
I have a question related to the tracking. So I know we're all pleased with that we are tracking the new categories that we've added. Are there other gaps that you see in tracking that we as advocates in the community can push the government to make changes in?
That's really interesting questions. I think at this point, one of the bigger issues is at least for us, turning around to our community and encouraging people to report. Because one of the conversations we had before the panel was, okay, which religion, is subject to the most hate crimes with respect to the data tracking? And I believe, my understanding, it's the Jewish community. But one of the, but they really encourage their community to support, to report, and they also have very strong relationships with law enforcement. So there's a lot of law enforcement reaching out to the Jewish community. So we sort of need to make those, strengthen that sort of from both ends. I know with the Muslim community, there's a whole other level of challenge with respect to trust.
I think that's, so to touch on what Simran said, is the trust with law enforcement is itself a huge issue. And so as much as, as important as the tracking developments are, where the community knows from both interaction as well as through litigation that law enforcement is being subject to and frequently perpetuating themselves policies of anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia, it's difficult for us to turn back around and say, well, call the police, right? Because, using sort of Simran's words, there is strong law enforcement outreach in certain segments of the community, but when they do it in the Muslim community, the civil rights advocates are like, no, you're not welcome here at this moment with your policies on spying, right? Is that when their own documents show that outreach is the guise used to surveil a community, then their outreach isn't welcome. And so that's sort of the law enforcement relationship piece is a challenge. Going back to our communities and saying, you do need to turn around and report these things is also sort of an ongoing thing. In a number of minority communities where I think maybe these issues are new, but also where people have internalized the oppression. So it's just normal. It's just our time. The other people have been through it. We just need to wait out our turn. It's a common sentiment we hear in the community a desire to not rock the boat. And then sort of the last thing, something that Samir touched on is hate incidents. And so when we talk about hate crimes, we also sort of have this other conversation about hate incidents where, you know, if someone walks past you, and people in the community are oftentimes surprised to learn this, if someone walks past you on the street and calls you a towel head and keeps going, there likely is nothing that law enforcement could do. But from an advocate's perspective, those instances should be documented as well, because if you have 3 dozen of those in the financial district in San Francisco in one summer, then maybe you know that there is some diversity education that needs to happen. And so law enforcement won't track that, but I think that the advocacy organizations generally do and are interested in hearing those stories, so encouraging people to even report those things.
I think in terms of gaps, I think some of it is yet to be seen in terms of how the FBI actually uses the information, because if a Hindu was attacked, for instance, but the attacker had no idea that the victim was Hindu and there was anti-Muslim rhetoric, is that just going to be categorized as an anti-Muslim crime? So if in a year we see 20 anti-Muslim crimes, let's say that were actually Hindu victims and 0 anti-Hindu crimes reported, you know, where's the kind of the gap there? I mean, how do we bridge that gap? How do we deal with actually identity of the victims? How are they going to deal with when there's multiple factors that may be involved? How are they going to track this? So I think there'll be a lot yet to be seen in how it's actually implemented going forward. And in my sense, we'll be able to get a better idea of where the gaps are, and those will kind of come up to the surface.
Yeah, I would add with respect implementation, and then there's also training, law enforcement training. For us, it's always been a battle when there is a hate crime. You know, a Sikh is called a terrorist or something like that. A lot of law enforcement just doesn't realize that that's bias motivation. So just educating, that's going to be a huge part of the implementation, is creating some sort of educational materials that help law enforcement recognize what bias motivation is towards these communities.
I think we have time for like one more question and then we'll wrap up. Any other burning thoughts or closing thoughts from folks?
Do you want to speak at once?
If not, we can also just wrap up and maybe stick around for a few minutes to talk one-on-one.
Actually, I have a random thought, something else about a gap, sorry. Is like, I've been intrigued with Angela's work since I started at CARE, and that's huge accreditation, Law Caucus, and the work that you've done. And the reason it's so fascinating for me is because when we have the hate crimes conversations internally in the community, a lot of times they're prosecute and punish, and so that's another sort of gap, is how do we build these bridges of alliance with communities that have been so targeted by law enforcement? Is that when hate crimes are crossing intersectionalities of race and ethnicity and sexual identification, then like when the perpetrator is from a black and brown community, or even from a white community where they themselves are persecuted by law enforcement, is throwing them in jail for 20 years the solution? When our schoolyards are being they're not being militarized, our borders are being militarized, but when our schoolyards are being policed so heavily, I mean, when I was growing up, like, getting bullied was normal, and hitting back was normal, and, you know, people didn't bring weapons to school, and police didn't show up and arrest 17-year-olds. And so that's another sort of place where I think there is a lot of opportunity for conversation and advocacy, both internally and externally. Victory isn't throwing the perpetrator in jail. Victory is eroding the source of the bias.
Thanks for that thought. I think I love hearing about the way restorative justice has, you know, you've worked with it, and having someone, hosting someone in your organization is really stepping up to the plate and doing that. And you know, it's good to know that sometimes it works. Sometimes that person, they're very nervous, and you guys come with kindness, which is totally, I think, the only way to do it. So I think that's, you know, I challenge us to think about those types of things, because I think when you do these legal service cases, you'll see it's really messy. It's not as clean cut as you all think, right? Sometimes when you first go into it, and so that's why part of the school bullying issue just led me down this path, because as I was helping members of the MEMSA community who were actually being bullied, they would fight back sometimes. Like, your general instinct is to fight back, and when you fight back, you might fight back based on race, because you were attacked based on race or religion. And then the way our school expulsion system works is they're not going to pick out the the white kid. They're going to pick out any of the minorities, and if there's a black kid and a Muslim kid get into a fight, both of them are going to get expelled. So, you know, there's no winning there, and is there another way of doing this? So I think that you know, that's kind of the next step, and how do we make it so that a restorative justice approach is taken seriously and it's used and integrated in the best way, and how do we deal with the limits, because the restorative justice system does depend on a criminal system. It's the carrot, there's the stick, and also how, because if someone doesn't want to use it, you go back to the traditional system. So that's kind of the next boundary there, is what do we do about that if we even start using it. So well, I want to maybe just thank our everyone for being here and for engaging in this conversation, and plug our next brown bag. And maybe Cora could pass out the brown bag flyer. We have, and Cora, thanks for organizing all this, and putting together the flyer and setting up this room, and also to Paul for helping out. So this is the first in our series. I think we have 3 or 4 more left. And the remainder of our series will focus on immigration reform, since that's the hot topic of the summer. And so there'll be immigration reform from the perspective of Asian American dreamers, immigration reform from the perspective of deportation defense and what's happening there, what are we trading away, and then immigration reform from the perspective of workers, especially low-wage workers. So we're going to go really deeply into that work through the rest of our brown bags. So thanks very much for our panelists for coming, and to Saba.
If you are seeking MCLE credits, Subvency is offering it for this event.
Oh, awesome.
So yes, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.